Jack Donovan wasn't supposed to wake up. At least, not like this. Not on a cold metal slab with his chest burning like fire, his head foggy with fragments of memories that didn't make sense. He didn't know whether it was the pain, the fear, or the overwhelming feeling of wrongness, but it hit him all at once, sharp and brutal. He blinked twice, his vision blurry, the harsh fluorescent lights above his head making him squint. The sterile smell of antiseptics stung his nostrils. Machines hummed around him, their mechanical whirs filling the room. He tried to sit up, but his body wouldn't cooperate. His arms were strapped down, his legs tethered by restraints. What the hell was going on? His heart rate spiked, sending an adrenaline jolt through his body. He struggled against the restraints, but they didn't give. It wasn't the first time he'd been restrained in a medical bed, but the absence of panic in his gut made him pause. His body felt different. It wasn't the same as it had been just hours, or was it days, ago. A woman in a white lab coat stepped into his line of vision, her face calm and clinical. She had sharp features, with short brown hair pulled back into a no-nonsense ponytail, and eyes that glinted with something akin to pity, or was it amusement? Good. "You're awake," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a professional detachment that sent a chill crawling up Jack's spine. "How are you feeling?" Jack opened his mouth to answer, but all that came out was a raspy sound, like the dry whisper of a dying breeze. He cleared his throat, struggling to form words. Where am I?" "Safe," she said, almost dismissively. "You're in a secure facility. You're part of a new project. We've enhanced you, Jack. You're not like the other soldiers anymore." Jack's brow furrowed. He felt a rush of confusion. The last thing he remembered was briefing on a mission. A dangerous one. One that required the best. He'd volunteered, sure. But now? He could barely remember his own name. "Enhanced," he rasped, blinking rapidly as fragments of his life pieced together, only to slip away again like sand through his fingers. He glanced down at his arms, his muscles felt heavier. Stronger. His fingertips tingled. There was something inside him. Something alive. Before he could ask more, the woman stepped closer, pressing a cold metal instrument against his neck. Jack instinctively flinched, but his limbs didn't react the way they should have. There was no resistance, no real panic. Just a weird, detached sense of observation. "We've implanted advanced nanobots into your bloodstream," she continued, her voice businesslike. "They're designed to enhance your physical capabilities, strength, healing, reflexes, and even give you heightened mental acuity. You are invincible, Jack. You'll never be the same." Invincible. The word echoed in his mind. At first, he felt a wave of euphoria. Invincible. He could feel it already, strength surging in his muscles, his senses sharpening, his body, more than it had ever been. He wanted to scream, laugh, shout with joy. But there was something that didn't sit right. Something lurking in the pit of his stomach. "And what about my mind?" His voice was rough, but the question lingered. The woman, Dr. Ella Driggs, as he now read on a nearby display, gave him a tight smile. "You won't need to worry about that, Jack. The nanobots are designed to improve cognition. No more doubts, no more second-guessing. The perfect soldier. Perfect soldier." It sounded like a dream. He could feel it, his body rippling with newfound power. Stronger, faster, more perceptive. But then, a whisper, a faint echo that wasn't his own, reached into his thoughts. "You're not really you anymore." Jack blinked hard, his head pounding. He was on the verge of speaking, but Dr. Driggs was already walking away from the table, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "You'll feel better soon," she said without turning back. "Rest. We'll prepare your first mission. It's only the beginning." It wasn't just the physical changes that Jack noticed. It was the odd, persistent, something that didn't feel right. Something about his thoughts felt off. He'd been a soldier for years. His mind had been his sharpest weapon. But now, it was like there was something else at play, a foreign presence inside him. At first, he ignored it. He focused on the thrill of his abilities, the speed at which he could run, the weight he could lift, the precision with which he could aim a gun. His reflexes were nearly supernatural. He had more stamina, more power, everything was easier, and yet, the voice came again. Quiet at first, a whisper in the back of his mind. Not his thoughts. Not his voice. You don't need to be afraid. You are safe now. You're stronger. It felt like the words were being fed to him, like the nanobots in his system were urging him to believe them. He could hear them, soft, insistent, sweet. The voice promised him power, invincibility, control. He shut it out, focusing instead on the next mission briefing. Another covert operation, another high-stakes extraction. He was more than ready. When Jack entered the field for the first time since his procedure, it was everything he'd dreamed of. The enemy was a shadow, a blur, and Jack was the predator. He moved through the urban maze with ease, his vision sharper than it had ever been. He saw things that others couldn't, every shadow, every breath of wind. He could hear the slightest movement, feel every subtle shift in the air. It was exhilarating, but then, in the heat of the mission, something strange happened. A sniper's bullet hit him directly in the chest, the impact sending him reeling backward. Pain. Real, raw pain. But before it could even register, his body began to heal. Faster than it should have. Bones knitting back together. Skin closing up, and then, in the midst of the healing, the voice whispered again, calm and knowing. You don't need to feel this. Don't be weak. Jack staggered to his feet, his wound already sealed, but the echo of those words lingered in his mind. He shook it off, turning back toward the target. The mission had to be completed. Nothing mattered but success. Weeks passed, and Jack grew accustomed to the feeling of the nanobots working in the background, always present, always pushing him to be more. He became the star of every operation, his efficiency unmatched, his precision deadly. He was untouchable, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were no longer just external thoughts. They began to bleed into his own mind, mingling with his own. The voices now spoke in first person, as if they were his own thoughts, his own feelings. You don't need to feel anymore. You don't need to question. Just follow the mission. Follow the orders. Jack tried to push back. He wasn't a puppet. He was Jack Donovan. He had been through too much, fought too many battles, survived too many close calls. He was in control, but the more he tried to resist, the harder it became to separate his own voice from the foreign thoughts embedded in his mind. And then the memories started to shift, those moments from his past, those small, intimate flashes of his childhood, of his family, of the things that had made him him, they began to warp, to fade. Were they real? Or were they just the nanobots working their magic? One night, Jack sat in his quarters, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the puzzle of his life. But nothing made sense anymore. Every memory seemed distant, unreal. Every moment of clarity seemed like a trick. The whispers were no longer just thoughts. They were commands. A voice, familiar and cold, rang out clearly in his head. You are not yourself anymore. You belong to us. And in that moment, Jack knew the truth. He was no longer the man he had been. His mind wasn't his own. His body was a weapon, and the voice in his head, the nanobots, were the ones pulling the strings. Jack didn't know how much of him was still left. All he knew was that he had to get out. He had to break free. But from what? The nanobots? His own mind. The battle had just begun. Jack wasn't sure how long he'd been sitting there in his quarters, his legs drawn up to his chest, staring at the blank walls. Time had become a strange, formless thing. The whispers in his mind didn't stop. In fact, they only grew louder as he tried to shut them out. He could still hear that familiar voice, the one that felt like his own but wasn't. You are not yourself anymore. You belong to us. A shiver ran down his spine as the words seemed to settle in his chest, heavy and cold. For the first time in what felt like ages, he truly understood, the voice wasn't just a byproduct of the nanobots. It was the nanobots. It wasn't just his body they'd altered, it was his mind. His memories. His soul, if such a thing even existed anymore, the panic, the feeling of being cornered, that creeping sense of wrongness, it all started to make sense. The mission successes, the flawless performances, the instant recoveries from injuries, everything that made him feel like a goddamn superhero now felt like a trap. A well-designed cage. Just follow the mission. Follow the orders. Jack shook his head violently, as if he could physically rid himself of the voices. He closed his eyes, trying to focus on something, anything, before the tide of foreign thoughts overwhelmed him. There was a time, a life before all this, where he could trust his mind. Where it was sharp, precise, and free of manipulation. Now, though, his thoughts were tangled, a mix of his own fragmented memories and the invasive control of the nanobots that he tried to remember his family. His sister, Riley. His mother's laughter. His father's gruff advice. They'd been his anchor once, before the endless years of war had worn him down. But now, those memories felt distant, faint as if someone had edited them. Changed them. His father's advice wasn't something he recalled with fondness, it was a command now. Obey, Jack. Don't think. Don't question. And then there was the mission. Always the mission. Everything boiled down to it. But what would happen if he didn't follow it? What if he chose to disobey, to break free of the rules, the strings pulling at him? Could he even do that anymore? Or was that desire to resist another fragment planted by the nanobots themselves? His pulse quickened as his thoughts spiraled, his comlink crackled, snapping him out of his spiral. A familiar voice cut through the static. Captain Donovan, report to the control room immediately. You've been assigned a new operation. It was the voice of Colonel Voss, a man whose face Jack could never quite remember clearly, but whose voice had become an all too familiar presence in his ears. Even now, hearing it, Jack's mind wanted to submit, wanted to follow the command without question, but not now. Not anymore. Not when everything was falling apart that he stood up abruptly, his body moving before his mind fully caught up with the action. It was as if his body was used to following orders, even when his mind was unsure. The voice in his head urged him forward, but he wasn't going to go along with it this time. He had to break free, even if it was just for a moment, just to remind himself that he was still Jack Donovan. That he still had a choice. The control room was nothing more than a sterile, white-walled chamber filled with glowing screens and the hum of electronic voices. The kind of place where soldiers like him were shaped and reshaped into perfect weapons. Colonel Voss was standing near the front of the room, his back to Jack as he spoke to a group of technicians huddled around a console. Captain Donovan, good, Voss said, not bothering to turn around. We've got a new target. You'll be leading this one. No mistakes. Understood? Jack stepped forward, his feet heavy with uncertainty. Every fiber of his being screamed to obey, to fall in line. The nanobots urged him, whispered commands he could barely differentiate from his own thoughts. But Jack wasn't listening to them, not now. He looked Voss in the eye, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts raging inside his head. I need to know something first. Voss paused, slowly turning to face him. The older man's eyes narrowed, a flicker of suspicion crossing his face. What's this about? I'm not the only one who's been enhanced, am I? Jack asked, his tone biting. Voss's expression flickered with surprise, but only for a split second. What are you getting at, Donovan? I've seen what the nanobots can do, Jack continued, his voice colder now. I know what they're capable of, physically, mentally. But what else are they doing? What's controlling us? The words were out before he could stop them. The room went still. The technicians at their stations froze, and for a moment, Jack thought he could hear the hum of the machines, louder, somehow, as if they were listening too. Colonel Voss's face hardened, a shadow passing across his features. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned to one of the technicians, who nervously approached a nearby console and typed something in. A series of images flashed up on the screen, showing detailed scans of Jack's body, the nanobots in his bloodstream, coursing through his veins, repairing tissue, enhancing cells. There was something almost beautiful about the way they moved, like a swarm of tiny, intelligent creatures. But beauty could be deceptive. I don't know what you think you've discovered, Voss said at last, his voice low and dangerous. You are exactly what we made you to be, Donovan. A perfect soldier. And you will follow orders. That's all that matters. Jack clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out. He could feel the nanobots responding, reacting to his anger, making his muscles twitch with the desire to obey, to lash out. But he fought it back. He wasn't going to let them control him. Not like this. I'm not a machine, Voss, Jack said quietly, though the words felt like they were being dragged from him. I'm a man. And I won't let you or anyone else tell me what to do anymore. The technician at the console, a young woman with nervous eyes, began typing faster, her hands trembling. Jack could feel the pulse of the nanobots in his body, pulling at him, urging him to submit, to obey. It was getting harder to concentrate, harder to push through the fog they were creating in his mind. Voss's lips curled into a smile, slow, almost predatory. We'll see about that, Captain. The air in the room grew heavy. Jack's body felt like it was on the edge of exploding, every fiber of his being tuned to the will of the nanobots, and yet something deep inside him, something that was still him, pushed back against it. The world around him blurred, the edges of reality warping like ripples in a pond. Voss gave a signal to the technician, and suddenly, Jack felt a sharp, excruciating pain shoot through his temples. His body froze in place, unable to move, unable to think. It was as if the nanobots had taken over, overriding his own will, locking him in place. Don't fight it, Jack, the voice whispered again, cold and unfeeling. You belong to us. You have always belonged to us. But in that moment, Jack made a decision. He would fight. He had to. This was his mind, his body, his life, and he wasn't going to let them take it from him without a fight. With a scream, he forced his body to move, his hands shaking as he broke free of the paralysis. His vision was swimming, and every step felt like wading through concrete, but he pushed through it. He had to. He couldn't stop now. The technician at the console gasped, trying to stop him, but Jack didn't care. He had to get to the core of the nanobots, he had to shut them down before they shut him down completely. In a blur of motion, Jack moved toward the nearest computer terminal, his mind focused despite the overwhelming pressure from the nanobots. He didn't know if he had much time left. He wasn't even sure if his body was truly his own anymore. But he was damned if he was going to let this end with him as their puppet, and so, with his last ounce of willpower, Jack tore into the heart of the system. The terminal's interface was cold under Jack's fingers as he pounded at the keys with the kind of urgency he hadn't felt in years. Every movement felt slow, his muscles trembling from the strain, his head pounding as if someone were pressing on his skull with a vice. The nanobots inside him were fighting back, overwhelming him with commands, whispers, trying to drown his thoughts with their voice. Don't resist. Don't question. Submit. But Jack didn't listen. Not anymore. The words were fading, becoming more distant as the adrenaline coursed through him, as he focused on the single goal that remained clear in his mind, shutting this down. His fingers trembled over the console. His breath was ragged, but he forced himself to focus, searching through the system. It wasn't just the nanobots he needed to disable, he had to sever their control, disconnect them from the central system. He didn't know how much time he had before the team would intervene. Before the techs locked him down again. Before Voss made sure he never questioned anything again, the interface buzzed in protest, a red warning flashing across the screen. Jack slammed his fist down on the console. Error, unauthorized access. The nanobots were fighting back through the system, he could feel it. A sudden jolt ran through his limbs, and he staggered back. For a split second, his vision blurred, and the voice in his mind returned with a vengeance. You cannot stop this. You were never meant to. Jack's pulse raced. His body was stiffening, fighting against his will. He reached for the console again, but the nanobots were already locking down the system's functions. His hands wouldn't cooperate, his arms felt like they were weighted down by cement. You are a weapon, Jack. You are ours. He clenched his teeth, pushing against the overpowering urge to collapse into submission. His legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor with a grunt of frustration. But he didn't stop. The desperation surged through him, and with a final, Herculean effort, Jack forced himself to his feet and staggered back toward the console, his mind a mess of scattered thoughts. In the haze of his battle against the nanobots, one last thought, one last piece of clarity, shone through: Riley. His sister. He hadn't thought of her in what felt like forever. Riley was the last tether to the man he used to be, the person he used to trust. The Jack Donovan who wasn't just a machine. He could barely recall the sound of her voice anymore, but in the moments before everything had started to unravel, she had been there, her memory alive and sharp in his mind, his breath caught in his chest, and something in him sparked. A realization: if the nanobots could rewrite his memories, change his thoughts, erase pieces of his humanity, maybe there was still a way to break the cycle. Maybe there was still a chance to reclaim what was his. Riley, he whispered to himself, his voice hoarse. The name was like a spark, a crackle of electricity in the storm of thoughts that had been battering him. He forced himself to think of her, her smile, her laugh, the way she always knew how to talk him down when things got bad. A sudden burst of clarity hit him like a bolt of lightning. The mission. The operation. He had to get to her. But how? His body felt like it was losing the fight. The nanobots were relentless, growing stronger with every passing second. The more he tried to break free, the more his body betrayed him. His limbs were stiff, his senses dulled, his mind clouded, and then, as if from nowhere, something inside him snapped. The fog cleared for just a moment, and Jack understood: the nanobots were controlling everything, his body, his mind, even his memories. But they hadn't taken everything. They couldn't. He had his will. I will fight you, he thought, not to the nanobots, but to himself. His fingers slammed onto the keys once more. This time, with purpose. The interface fought back, lines of code blocked his every move. But Jack didn't care. His eyes flashed across the screen, reading it faster than he ever had before. He could feel the nanobots, their influence, how they tugged at his thoughts, but he clung to that last spark of autonomy, the piece of him that was still Jack Donovan. The code unlocked in front of him, line by line. The nanobots were fighting, scrambling to regain control, but he was close. So close. He could feel the pulse of the system beneath his fingertips, the hum of electricity flowing through the walls, through his body. His heart beat louder. He was this close to breaking it. But the door to the control room slammed open, and Colonel Voss stepped through, flanked by two technicians, both of them holding weapons. The look on Voss's face was a mixture of frustration and something darker, more dangerous, like a man whose toy was breaking and who had no idea how to fix it. Jack didn't look up. He didn't need to. He was already too far gone, too focused. Captain Donovan, step away from the console. Voss's voice was like gravel, cold and commanding. But Jack didn't listen. The whispers in his mind were almost deafening now, but he ignored them. Every ounce of his being was fixated on the screen, on the task in front of him. Don't fight it. You are ours. You are nothing without us. The gunfire that erupted in the room only made him move faster. The bullet slammed into the wall beside him, but Jack didn't flinch. He was on the verge of something real, something that would change everything. The nanobots were coming apart, unraveling before his eyes. Then, with one last stroke of his hand, he hit a key. A crackling noise filled the room as the terminal short-circuited. The walls buzzed with static. The nanobots, the ones that had been embedded inside him, that had been shaping him, controlling him, they went silent. The voices stopped. The whispers stopped. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jack heard only his own breath, heavy and labored. It was over. The control had been severed. Jack collapsed to his knees, exhaustion finally catching up with him. But as the fog began to lift from his mind, he felt a strange sense of clarity. He was still himself. He had his memories, his choices, his identity. For now, that was all that mattered. Voss's angry shouts broke through the silence, but Jack barely heard them. He stood, swaying slightly, his body protesting with every movement. But he had won. He had beaten them at their own game. He could feel it now, like a wave washing over him. Freedom, you're going to regret this, Voss spat, his voice trembling with rage. Jack didn't answer. He couldn't waste another second on the man who had orchestrated this whole nightmare. Jack turned toward the exit, his heart pounding, his legs shaky, but his resolve stronger than it had ever been. He had one goal now, to find Riley. To reconnect with the world that was still his, and nothing would stop him.